Marcus Rivera had been invisible for 3 years. He moved through the city like a shadow, unnoticed by the rushing crowds who stepped around him without ever meeting his eyes. At 42, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had once commanded respect, but now that same bearing marked him as different, dangerous, untouchable in a world that preferred its heroes clean and housed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cardboard beneath Marcus felt damp from the morning dew that had settled over Meridian Park. He had claimed this corner spot behind the maintenance shed 3 months ago, a strategic position that offered shelter from the wind and concealment from the park rangers who made their rounds every Tuesday and Friday. His worldly possessions fit into 2 canvas duffel bags, military surplus from a time when such gear had meaning beyond mere survival. Beside him, sprawled on a ratty beach towel that had seen better decades, lay his constant companion. Duke was a 7-year-old mixed breed with the soulful brown eyes of a German shepherd and the compact frame of something smaller, maybe a Border Collie. His coat was a patchwork of black and tan, matted in places despite Marcus's efforts to keep him groomed with a dollar store brush. The dog's left ear had been torn in a fight with a raccoon 2 winters back, giving him a perpetually quizzical expression that somehow made him more endearing to the few people who bothered to notice. Marcus had found Duke, or perhaps Duke had found him, during his first brutal winter on the streets. The puppy had been nothing more than a shivering bundle of fur huddled behind a dumpster, ribs showing through his thin coat, eyes already holding the wariness of an animal that had learned the world was not a safe place. Marcus had shared his meager dinner that night, a half-eaten sandwich salvaged from a coffee shop trash bin, and Duke had never left his side since. The morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves and car exhaust, mixing with the less pleasant odors that clung to places where society's forgotten gathered. Marcus pulled his army surplus jacket tighter around his shoulders, the fabric worn thin at the elbows but still bearing the faded patch from his old unit, the 82nd Airborne Division. The patch was one of the few things that connected him to the man he used to be, before everything fell apart, before the desert took pieces of his mind that he could never get back. Duke stirred, lifting his head to scan the horizon with the alertness of a sentry. Even in sleep, the dog maintained a vigilance that Marcus recognized from his own military days. They were both soldiers now, fighting a different kind of war on unfamiliar terrain. Duke's ears perked forward, catching sounds that Marcus's damaged hearing couldn't detect. 3 years of sleeping rough had taught them both to trust their instincts, to read the subtle signs that meant safety or danger. The park was beginning to come alive with the first wave of morning joggers, their expensive running shoes slapping against the asphalt paths in rhythmic precision. They moved past Marcus's corner without acknowledgement, their eyes fixed on their fitness trackers and smartphones, existing in a parallel universe where homeless veterans were merely part of the landscape, no more noteworthy than the park benches or trash cans. Marcus remembered when he used to be one of them, when he had an apartment with running water and a kitchen that worked, when his biggest concern was whether to hit the gym before or after work. That life felt like a movie he had watched once, vivid but ultimately unreal. The transition from housed to homeless had been swift and merciless, a cascade of failures that had left him reeling long after the final blow had landed. The injuries from his last deployment had been the beginning of the end. Not the dramatic visible wounds that earned sympathy and purple hearts, but the invisible ones that ate away at a man from the inside. The nightmares that turned sleep into a battlefield, the hypervigilance that made civilian life feel like walking through a minefield. The depression that descended like fog, obscuring any path forward. He had tried the Veterans Administration hospitals, had sat in waiting rooms for hours only to be handed prescriptions for medications that made him feel like a stranger in his own skin. The pills helped with the nightmares but stole everything else, leaving him numb and disconnected from a world that already felt impossibly distant. He had stopped taking them after 6 months, preferring the sharp edges of his pain to the cottony numbness of pharmaceutical intervention. The job had gone next, a steady position with the city's water department that he had held for 2 years after his discharge. The work had been simple routine, the kind of structure that had helped him maintain the illusion of normal life. But the panic attacks had started coming during the day, triggered by sounds that reminded him of incoming mortars, by crowds that felt too much like potential threats. His supervisor had been patient at first, understanding even, but patience had limits when productivity suffered. After the job came the apartment, then the car, then the last of his savings. Each loss had felt manageable in isolation, part of a temporary setback that he could recover from with enough determination and hard work. But recovery required resources he no longer possessed, and each failure made the next one more likely, until he found himself sleeping in his car in a Walmart parking lot, then under highway overpasses, and finally here in Meridian Park with a dog who asked nothing of him except his presence. Duke stretched and yawned, his pink tongue curling as he worked the stiffness from his joints. The dog's morning routine was as predictable as Marcus's own, a series of small rituals that imposed order on their chaotic existence. First came the reconnaissance, a careful survey of their immediate surroundings to identify any changes or threats that might have emerged during the night. Then the morning constitutional, a walk to the edge of their territory, where Duke would handle his business with the dignity of a creature who understood the importance of maintaining standards even in reduced circumstances. Marcus rose slowly, his own joints protesting the movement. 3 years of sleeping on hard ground had not been kind to a body already damaged by military service and the accumulated wear of middle age. He folded the cardboard with practiced efficiency, tucking it into one of his duffel bags where it would stay dry and ready for the next night's use. The beach towel followed, shaken out and rolled tight despite its raggedness. Their morning walk took them along the perimeter of the park, following paths that Marcus had memorized during countless similar excursions. Duke trotted beside him with the easy gait of a dog accustomed to long distances, his nose working constantly as he catalogued the overnight changes in their domain. They passed the public restrooms where Marcus would wash his face and hands with the harsh soap from the dispensers, past the playground where children would arrive later with their mothers and nannies, past the memorial garden where old veterans sometimes gathered to remember wars that felt simultaneously recent and ancient. The city was waking up around them, the steady hum of traffic building as commuters began their migration from suburb to downtown. Marcus felt the familiar weight of invisibility settling over him like a cloak. To the passing world, he and Duke were fixtures now, as permanent and unremarkable as the park's statuary. People had learned to look through him, their gazes sliding past without recognition or acknowledgement. He understood the psychology behind their blindness. Homeless veterans were uncomfortable reminders of uncomfortable truths, evidence that the social contract could be broken, that service to country was no guarantee against catastrophic failure. It was easier to pretend they didn't exist than to confront the implications of their presence on America's streets. At the edge of the park, where the manicured grass gave way to sidewalk and the real world reasserted itself, Marcus made his daily decision about breakfast. The shelter on 5th Street served hot meals starting at 7, but accepting charity required standing in line with dozens of other broken souls, required submitting to the well-intentioned interrogation of social workers who wanted to help him find his way back to conventional life. Marcus had tried the shelters during his first winter on the streets, had endured the intake interviews and the case management sessions and the group therapy meetings where men like him were encouraged to share their stories with strangers who nodded sympathetically and took notes on clipboards. The help was genuine, he knew that, but it came wrapped in assumptions about what recovery should look like, about the kind of life a man was supposed to want. Instead, he turned toward the commercial district where the coffee shops and bakeries were beginning their daily routines. Dumpster diving had become an art form for Marcus, a skill that required timing, discretion, and an ability to distinguish between genuinely discarded food and refuse that posed health risks. Duke had developed his own expertise in this area, his sensitive nose capable of detecting spoilage that human senses might miss. Behind Romano's bakery, Marcus found the morning's treasure, a bag of day-old pastries, still in their wax paper wrapping, discarded not because they were inedible, but because the bakery's policy required absolute freshness for paying customers. He selected a blueberry muffin for himself and broke off pieces of a plain croissant for Duke, who accepted his portion with the grave courtesy of a dinner guest at a formal meal. They ate in silence, watching the city come alive around them. Office workers emerged from the subway station across the street, their faces fixed in expressions of determined efficiency. School children waited at bus stops under the watchful eyes of parents who glanced nervously at Marcus before hurrying their offspring along. The morning routine of normal life proceeded according to its ancient rhythms, and Marcus felt both envious of its predictability and grateful for his exclusion from its demands. Duke finished his breakfast and settled at Marcus's feet, his body warm against his owner's leg. The dog's presence was a constant comfort, a living reminder that connection was still possible, even when human relationships had become too complicated to navigate. Duke asked nothing of him except consistency, loyalty, and the occasional scratch behind his good ear. In return, the dog offered companionship without judgment, protection without violence, and a reason to keep moving forward when forward motion seemed pointless. The morning stretched ahead of them, another day in a series that had begun to blur together in Marcus's memory. They would walk the city's streets, following routes that had become as familiar as the corridors of his childhood home. They would avoid the business districts where security guards moved homeless people along, would skirt the residential neighborhoods where concerned citizens called police about suspicious characters, would seek out the liminal spaces where society's attention grew thin, and men like Marcus could exist without constant harassment. Duke suddenly tensed, his ears swiveling toward a sound that Marcus couldn't identify. The dog's hackles rose slightly, not in aggression but in alertness, the way they did when something in their environment had changed in ways that required investigation. Marcus followed the dog's gaze and saw nothing immediately threatening, just the usual morning traffic and pedestrians going about their business. But Duke's instincts had been honed by 3 years of street life, and Marcus had learned to trust them completely. The dog's sensitivity to danger had saved them both from confrontations with hostile police officers, from encounters with other homeless individuals whose desperation had turned predatory, from situations that could have escalated beyond their ability to manage. A police cruiser rounded the corner, moving slowly in the manner of officers conducting routine patrol rather than responding to specific calls. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the conditioned response of a man who had learned that law enforcement viewed him as a problem to be managed rather than a citizen to be protected. He gathered his bags and rose smoothly to his feet, Duke falling into position beside him with practiced ease. They moved away from the commercial district, following side streets that led deeper into the residential areas where patrol cars were less common. The houses here were modest but well-maintained, small yards enclosed by chain-link fences, porches decorated with seasonal displays that spoke of stable lives lived according to conventional schedules. Marcus remembered living in neighborhoods like this, remembered the satisfaction of mowing grass and cleaning gutters and maintaining the small rituals of domestic life. The memory carried no bitterness, just a distant melancholy for a version of himself that had believed such things mattered, that had assumed his place in the world was secure and permanent. Duke padded beside him with easy confidence, his damaged ear flicking occasionally as he monitored their surroundings. The dog had adapted to homelessness with the resilience that animals brought to changing circumstances, accepting their new reality without the psychological weight that made adaptation so difficult for humans. For Duke, home was wherever Marcus happened to be, and security was measured not in terms of 4 walls and a roof but in the consistency of their partnership. They passed their elementary school where children were arriving for the day, their bright backpacks and animated chatter a stark contrast to the quiet intensity that surrounded Marcus and Duke. A few of the younger children stared openly, their curiosity not yet filtered through adult assumptions about appropriate social distance. Marcus met their gazes briefly before looking away, not wanting to cause alarm among the parents and teachers who supervised the morning routine. One little girl with pigtails and a purple jacket broke away from her group, approaching the chain-link fence that separated the school property from the sidewalk. She pressed her face against the metal links, her attention focused entirely on Duke, who had stopped to investigate an interesting scent near a fire hydrant. "What's your doggie's name?" she called out, her voice carrying the uninhibited friendliness of childhood. Marcus hesitated, unused to direct interaction with strangers, especially children whose innocence made him acutely aware of how far he had fallen from conventional respectability. "Duke," he answered simply, his voice rusty from limited use. The girl smiled with delight, as if he had shared some wonderful secret. "He looks like a good doggy," she said, then turned as a teacher called her name, skipping away without a backward glance. The brief exchange left Marcus feeling oddly unsettled, reminded of a capacity for normal human connection that he had assumed was permanently damaged. Duke had witnessed the interaction with the patient interest of a creature accustomed to being the bridge between his owner and the wider world. People who might cross the street to avoid Marcus would sometimes stop to pet Duke, their guard lowered by the universal appeal of a friendly dog. These encounters were brief and superficial, but they served to remind Marcus that he had not become completely invisible, that some part of him still registered as human to those willing to look closely enough. They continued their morning walk, leaving the school behind as they entered a neighborhood of older houses with larger yards and mature trees. This area had a different energy, quieter and more settled, the kind of place where people had lived for decades and knew their neighbors by name. Marcus felt like an intruder here, his presence a disruption of the established order that these streets represented. But Duke trotted along with obvious pleasure, his nose working overtime as he processed the complex scent profiles of well-established territory. Dogs had been walking these sidewalks for generations, leaving invisible markers that told stories Marcus could never hope to understand.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In Duke's world, they were simply exploring, following trails of information that connected them to the broader community of creatures who called this place home. A woman emerged from one of the houses ahead, an elderly lady with silver hair and a housecoat who moved slowly down her front steps toward a mailbox at the curb. She paused as she noticed Marcus and Duke approaching, her expression shifting from casual awareness to something approaching concern. Marcus prepared to cross the street, to remove himself from her field of vision before discomfort could transform into fear or complaint. But instead of retreating, the woman continued her path to the mailbox, opening it and retrieving the morning delivery. As Marcus drew closer, she looked up at him directly, her gaze taking in his appearance, with the frank assessment of someone who had lived long enough to see beyond surface appearances. "That's a handsome dog you've got there," she said, her voice carrying the slight tremor of advanced age, but none of the nervousness Marcus had expected. Duke, as if sensing her genuine interest, moved slightly closer to the fence that bordered her property, his tail moving in a tentative wag. "Thank you, ma'am," Marcus replied, stopping his forward progress as politeness seemed to require some acknowledgement of her comment. The woman studied Duke with the knowledgeable eye of someone familiar with animals. "German Shepherd mixed with something smaller, I'd guess," she continued, seemingly oblivious to the social protocols that usually governed interactions between housed and homeless individuals. "He's got the alertness but not quite the size. Border Collie, maybe." Marcus found himself drawn into the conversation despite his instincts for self-preservation. That's what the vet thought, back when. He trailed off, realizing he had been about to reference a time when veterinary care had been within his reach, when Duke's well-being had been something he could ensure through conventional means.
The woman nodded as if she understood the incomplete thought. Smart breeds, both of them. High maintenance, though. They need jobs to do, purposes to serve. Gets them in trouble when they're bored. She was describing Duke perfectly, Marcus realized. The dog's intelligence was evident in how quickly he had adapted to their circumstances, how he had learned the intricate rules of street survival, how he seemed to anticipate Marcus's needs before they were voiced. But that same intelligence sometimes created restlessness, moments when Duke would pace their small territory, as if searching for challenges worthy of his capabilities. "He keeps me out of trouble," Marcus said, surprised by his own willingness to extend the conversation. The woman smiled, an expression that transformed her lined face and revealed traces of the beauty she must have possessed in younger years. "Dogs have a way of doing that," she agreed. "They see things we miss, know things we don't think to consider. My Harold used to say that a man with a good dog never lacks for wise counsel." Harold, Marcus assumed, was no longer present, judging by her use of the past tense. The reference created a moment of shared understanding, an acknowledgement that both of them were navigating life with important absences, though the nature of their losses was undoubtedly different. "Well," the woman continued, gathering her mail and preparing to return to her house, "you take care of each other. This neighborhood can use more folks who understand the value of loyalty." She turned and walked back toward her front door, leaving Marcus standing on the sidewalk with a strange mixture of emotions churning in his chest. The encounter had been so normal, so free of the judgment and discomfort that usually characterized his interactions with housed individuals, that it felt almost surreal. Duke looked up at him as if to confirm that the exchange had actually occurred. They resumed their walk, but the rhythm felt different now, less defensive and more exploratory. The woman's casual acceptance had created a small crack in the wall of invisibility that Marcus had constructed around himself, a reminder that human connection remained possible even under the most unlikely circumstances. As they reached the end of the residential street, Duke suddenly stopped and turned his head toward a narrow alley that ran between two apartment buildings. The dog's body language shifted, becoming focused and alert in a way that Marcus recognized as significant. Duke rarely displayed interest in unfamiliar territory without good reason, and his instincts had proven reliable in the past. Marcus followed Duke's gaze down the alley, seeing nothing immediately noteworthy. The passage was clean and well maintained, leading to what appeared to be a small courtyard or parking area behind the buildings. But Duke's attention remained fixed, his ears forward and his tail held high with interest rather than alarm. "What is it, boy?" Marcus asked quietly, trusting Duke's perceptions even when his own senses detected nothing unusual. The dog took a step toward the alley entrance, then looked back at Marcus as if seeking permission to investigate further. Marcus hesitated. Their survival depended on routine, on following established patterns that kept them safe and invisible. Exploring unfamiliar territory introduced variables that could lead to complications, encounters with property owners or security personnel, situations that could escalate beyond their ability to control. But something in Duke's demeanor suggested this was different, that whatever had captured the dog's attention was worth investigating. Marcus had learned to read Duke's body language with the precision of a translator, and right now every signal the dog was sending spoke of opportunity rather than danger. "All right," Marcus said softly, adjusting his grip on his duffel bags. "Let's take a look." They moved into the alley with Duke leading the way, his pace confident but careful. The passage was wider than it had appeared from the street, with brick walls that showed signs of recent cleaning and maintenance. Halfway down, the alley opened into a small courtyard surrounded by the back entrances of several apartment buildings. But what held Duke's attention, what had drawn him into this unexpected detour, was a small building at the far end of the courtyard that Marcus had not noticed from the street. It was clearly institutional in nature, with the kind of practical architecture that suggested governmental or non-profit ownership. A modest sign beside the front door read Riverside Community Outreach Center, and beneath that in smaller letters, serving veterans and their families since 2018. Marcus felt his chest tighten at the sight. He had carefully avoided such places during his years on the street, had developed an instinctive aversion to the well-meaning organizations that promised help in exchange for compliance with their vision of what his life should become. The intake interviews, the case management appointments, the group therapy sessions where men like him were encouraged to share their trauma with strangers who took notes and offered resources that came with strings attached. But Duke was moving toward the building with unmistakable purpose, drawn by something that Marcus couldn't identify. The dog's tail wagged steadily as he approached the front entrance, his entire demeanor suggesting recognition or familiarity that made no logical sense. As they drew closer, Marcus could see that the building was clearly occupied and active. Windows glowed with warm light, and he could hear the faint sounds of human activity from within. A small garden beside the entrance showed signs of careful tending, with late-season flowers still blooming despite the approaching winter. Duke stopped directly in front of the main door and sat looking up at Marcus with an expression of patient expectation. It was the same look he gave when they reached their destination during their daily walks, when he had successfully guided them to food or shelter or safety. But they had never been to this place before, had never had any reason to seek out another veteran services organization. Marcus stood beside his dog, staring at the building that Duke seemed to recognize as important in ways that escaped human understanding. The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the courtyard and highlighting details that spoke of an organization that took pride in its mission and its facilities. Through one of the windows, Marcus caught a glimpse of the interior. It looked nothing like the sterile institutional spaces he associated with veteran services. Instead, he saw what appeared to be a comfortable common area with couches and coffee tables, walls decorated with photographs rather than motivational posters, an atmosphere that suggested community rather than charity. Duke remained seated, his gaze alternating between the building's entrance and Marcus's face. The dog's patience was infinite, but his message was clear. This place was significant. This place was where they needed to be. Marcus felt the familiar war between his instincts for self-preservation and the growing recognition that their current existence, while sustainable, was not really living. 3 years of careful invisibility had kept them safe, but had also kept them isolated, cut off from the human connections that gave life meaning and purpose. He thought about the elderly woman they had encountered earlier, about her casual acceptance and genuine interest in Duke's well-being. He thought about the little girl at the school who had seen past his appearance to ask about his dog's name. Small cracks in the wall of invisibility that suggested the possibility of something more. Duke's tail thumped against the ground once, a gentle reminder that they were still standing in front of a door that remained unopened. The dog's instincts had brought them this far, had guided them through 3 years of challenges and dangers, had led them to safety and sustenance when human judgment might have failed. Marcus reached for the door handle, his hand trembling slightly with the weight of decision. Behind that door lay the unknown, the possibility of connection and community, but also the risk of exposure and vulnerability. It was a threshold that once crossed might change everything about their carefully constructed existence. Duke looked up at him with absolute trust, confident that whatever decision Marcus made would be the right one. The dog's faith was both humbling and terrifying, a reminder that his choices affected not just his own fate, but that of the creature who had chosen to share his journey through the margins of society. The morning air carried the scent of autumn and possibility, mixing with the familiar smells of urban life that had become their natural environment. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour, marking the passage of time and the approach of decisions that could not be postponed indefinitely. Marcus stood at the threshold between his old life and whatever might come next, his loyal companion beside him, both of them poised at the edge of transformation, neither fully understood, but both somehow recognized as inevitable. The door opened to reveal a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt that spoke of someone more comfortable with action than formality. Her gaze took in Marcus and Duke with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating need without judgment. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the warm authority of a natural leader. "I'm Sarah Chen, director here at Riverside. That's a beautiful dog you have there." Marcus found himself caught off guard by her directness, her complete lack of the institutional formality he had expected. Duke's tail wagged enthusiastically, as if he had been waiting his entire life to meet this particular person. The dog stepped forward slightly, still maintaining his position beside Marcus, but clearly indicating his approval of their new acquaintance. "He led me here," Marcus said, the words emerging before he could filter them through his usual caution. "I'm not sure why." Sarah's smile deepened, transforming her face in a way that suggested genuine amusement rather than professional courtesy. "Dogs often know things we don't. Would you like to come in? We've got coffee brewing, and I'd love to hear more about what brought you both to our door." The invitation was casual, free of the paperwork and intake procedures that Marcus associated with service organizations. He hesitated, his ingrained wariness warring with Duke's obvious enthusiasm and his own growing curiosity about this place that felt different from every other veteran services facility he had encountered. "I should mention," Sarah continued, seeming to sense his uncertainty, "we're a bit unusual here. No forms to fill out on your first visit, no requirements except basic respect for other people."
Think of it as stopping by a neighbor's house for coffee. Duke made the decision for both of them, moving forward into the building with confident strides. Marcus followed, his duffel bags feeling suddenly heavier as he crossed the threshold into unfamiliar territory. The interior matched what he had glimpsed through the window, comfortable and welcoming rather than institutional. The walls were decorated with photographs of veterans from different eras, not formal portraits but candid shots that captured moments of genuine human connection. The common area contained several couches and armchairs arranged in conversational groupings, with coffee tables bearing magazines, books, and what appeared to be ongoing chess games. A kitchen area occupied one corner, its counters clean but clearly well used. The entire space hummed with quiet activity. Veterans of various ages engaged in conversations, reading, or simply enjoying the warmth and companionship the center provided. "We serve about 40 veterans regularly," Sarah explained as she led them toward the kitchen area. "Some come daily, others weekly, a few just when they need a safe place to land. Everyone's welcome, everyone's story matters." Marcus noticed that several of the men looked up as they passed, their gazes taking in his appearance and circumstances, without the pity or discomfort he usually encountered. These were men who understood, who had walked similar paths even if their destinations had been different. A few nodded in greeting, the subtle acknowledgement of one veteran to another. Duke trotted beside them with obvious pleasure, his tail creating a steady rhythm against his legs. The dog's comfort in this environment was remarkable, as if he had spent years preparing for this exact moment. He paused to greet several of the veterans, accepting scratches behind his ears with the gracious dignity of her ambassador making diplomatic rounds. "Coffee's fresh," Sarah announced, pouring 2 cups from a commercial-grade machine that suggested serious commitment to caffeine quality. "Cream and sugar are on the counter. How do you take it?" "Black," Marcus replied, accepting the ceramic mug with hands that trembled slightly. The coffee was excellent, rich and strong without the bitter edge he associated with institutional brewing. He found himself wondering about the funding that allowed for such quality, about the philosophy that prioritized comfort over cost efficiency. "So tell me about Duke," Sarah said, settling into a chair across from him. "How long have you two been partners?" The question was perfectly calibrated, Marcus realized.
Not intrusive enough to trigger his defenses, but specific enough to demonstrate genuine interest. Duke had positioned himself between their chairs, close enough to both humans to maintain contact while keeping watch over the broader room. 3 years, Marcus answered. Found him as a puppy, or he found me. Been together ever since. Street dogs develop incredible instincts, Sarah observed. They learn to read people's situations, environments in ways that housed dogs never need to. Duke strikes me as particularly intuitive. She was right, Marcus knew. Duke's survival skills had been honed by necessity, his ability to distinguish between genuine threat and harmless activity, refined through experience that most dogs would never accumulate. The dog had learned to navigate a world that viewed him and Marcus as problems to be managed rather than individuals deserving of consideration. He keeps me alive, Marcus said simply, surprised again by his willingness to share personal information with a relative stranger. Something about Sarah's manner, about the atmosphere of the center itself, seemed to dissolve his usual guardedness. That's what good partners do, she agreed. Look out for each other, fill in each other's blind spots. Military working dogs understand that better than most. The reference to military service was casual, delivered without the weight that such discussions usually carried. Marcus found himself studying Sarah more closely, looking for the signs that would identify her as a veteran herself. Her posture carried the subtle alertness he recognized in others who had served. Her way of speaking suggested familiarity with military culture that went beyond professional training. You served, he asked. Army medic, 2 tours in Iraq, she replied. Matter-of-factly, got out in 2012, spent a few years figuring out what civilian life was supposed to look like. Started this place when I realized how many of us were struggling with the same questions. The revelation shifted something in Marcus's perception of their interaction. Sarah wasn't a social worker or civilian volunteer trying to help people she didn't really understand. She was one of them, someone who had walked through the fire and emerged on the other side with enough strength to extend a hand to others still making the journey. What makes this place different? Marcus asked, gesturing toward the room around them where veterans continued their conversations and activities in comfortable normalcy. We start with the assumption that everyone who walks through that door is a capable adult who knows what they need, Sarah explained. Our job isn't to fix people or impose solutions, it's to provide resources and let folks make their own decisions about how to use them. The philosophy was revolutionary in Marcus's experience with service organizations. Every other facility he had encountered had operated from a deficit model, treating homeless veterans as broken individuals who needed professional intervention to return to acceptable functionality. The condescension had been subtle but unmistakable, embedded in intake procedures that catalogued failures and treatment plans that prescribed standardized paths to recovery. We have housing coordinators who can help navigate the VA system, Sarah continued, employment counselors who understand the challenges of translating military experience to civilian jobs, mental health professionals who specialize in combat trauma. But nobody gets assigned a caseworker, nobody gets required to attend mandatory meetings. You use what helps, ignore what doesn't. Duke had found a sunny spot on the floor and stretched out with obvious contentment, his body language indicating complete relaxation in a way that Marcus rarely observed. The dog's comfort served as a barometer of the environment's genuine safety, confirming what Marcus's own instincts were beginning to suggest about this place. Can I ask what brought you here this morning? Sarah inquired gently. You mentioned Duke led you, but I'm curious about what made you decide to come inside. Marcus considered the question, trying to articulate the complex mixture of impulses that had brought him to this moment. Duke's insistence had been the immediate catalyst, but deeper currents had been building for weeks, months perhaps. The growing recognition that mere survival wasn't enough, that the careful invisibility he had cultivated was protecting him from connection as much as from harm. I've been on the streets for 3 years, he began slowly. Became good at being invisible, staying out of trouble. But lately, I don't know. Duke's been restless, like he's looking for something more. Maybe I am too. Sarah nodded with the understanding of someone who had heard similar stories many times before. Survival mode is necessary when you're in crisis, but it's not sustainable long term. There comes a point where you have to decide whether you're going to just exist or actually live. The distinction resonated with Marcus in ways that surprised him. He had been existing for 3 years, moving through each day with the mechanical precision of someone focused entirely on basic needs. Food, shelter, safety, repeat. But living required something more, demanded engagement with the world beyond mere survival. What would living look like, he asked, the question emerging from a part of himself that had been silent for so long he had assumed it was permanently damaged. Different for everyone, Sarah replied. For some folks it's getting housed and finding work. For others it's reconnecting with family, or pursuing education or contributing to their community. The key is figuring out what matters to you, what would make you feel like yourself again. Marcus tried to remember what had mattered to him before everything fell apart, before the injuries and the medications and the cascade of failures that had led him to Meridian Park. The memories felt distant, like photographs of someone else's life, but they were still there beneath the accumulated layers of survival and resignation. He had liked fixing things, he remembered. During his deployment, he had been the guy other soldiers came to when equipment broke down, when problems required creative solutions rather than standard procedures. After his discharge, the job with the water department had satisfied that same impulse, the pleasure of identifying problems and developing effective responses. I used to be good with my hands, he said tentatively. Mechanical work repairs that kind of thing. We've got a workshop in the back, Sarah mentioned casually. Nothing fancy but decent tools and space to work on projects. Some guys come in just to tinker, others take on repairs for the center, or help neighbors fix things. Keeps the hands busy and the mind occupied. The idea of having access to tools again, of being able to create and repair rather than simply scavenge and survive, stirred something in Marcus that he had thought was permanently dormant. Duke lifted his head at the change in his owner's posture, sensing the shift in emotional energy even before Marcus was fully conscious of it himself. Would you like to see it? Sarah offered. No obligation, just a quick tour if you're curious. Marcus found himself nodding, following her deeper into the building as Duke trotted alongside them. The workshop occupied a converted storage room, its walls lined with pegboard holding tools in neat arrangements. Several workbenches provided space for different types of projects, and the smell of sawdust and metal shavings created an atmosphere that Marcus recognized from his younger years when he had learned basic repair skills from his grandfather. 2 veterans were working at separate benches, one repairing what appeared to be a bicycle, the other sanding a piece of furniture that looked like it was being restored rather than built from scratch. They looked up as Sarah led the tour through, offering nods of greeting before returning to their work with the focused concentration of men who had found purposes worth pursuing. We get donations of broken stuff from all over the neighborhood, Sarah explained. Bikes, furniture, small appliances, you name it.
Guys fix what they can, and we either return the items to the donors or find people who can use them. It's not about the money, it's about the satisfaction of making things work again. Marcus could envision himself in this space, his hands occupied with concrete problems that had definable solutions. The work would be voluntary, chosen rather than assigned, performed at his own pace according to his own standards. The autonomy was crucial, he realized, the difference between charity and partnership. Duke had discovered a pile of canvas drop cloths in one corner and was investigating them with the thoroughness of a creature who appreciated comfortable resting spots. The dog's continued ease in the environment reinforced Marcus's growing sense that this place operated according to different principles than the institutional settings he had learned to avoid. There's something else I should probably mention, Sarah said as they prepared to return to the main area. We're not just a drop-in center,
We've got transitional housing units upstairs, efficiency apartments for veterans who are ready to take that step. Nothing fancy, but private space with cooking facilities and room for pets. The information hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because it was unwelcome, but because it represented possibilities he had stopped, allowing himself to consider. Housing meant more than just shelter. It meant the potential for privacy, for routines that extended beyond daily survival, for a life that included Duke without the constant uncertainty of their current existence. What's the catch? Marcus asked, his wariness reasserting itself in the face of an offer that seemed too good to be true. No catch, Sarah replied. Just practical limitations. We've got 6 units, usually full with waiting lists. Priority goes to folks who've been working with us for a while, who've demonstrated that they're ready for the responsibilities that come with housing, not because we don't trust people, but because we want to set everyone up for success. The honesty was refreshing, acknowledging the realities of limited resources without wrapping them in bureaucratic language or moral judgments. Marcus appreciated the straightforward explanation, the recognition that housing was a significant step that required preparation and commitment. They returned to the main area where the morning routine continued undisturbed. Marcus observed the interactions between veterans, noting the easy camaraderie that developed when men who had shared similar experiences were allowed to connect without professional mediation. Conversations ranged from practical matters like job leads and housing applications to lighter topics like sports and current events. "I should probably get going," Marcus said, though he felt little urgency to leave. Duke showed no signs of wanting to depart, having settled into a routine of greeting newcomers and accepting attention from anyone willing to provide it. "You're welcome to stay as long as you'd like," Sarah offered. "Coffee's always fresh and lunch gets served starting at 11:30. Nothing required, no paperwork to sign. Consider it an open invitation." Marcus felt the familiar tension between his instincts for self-preservation and his growing recognition that isolation might be more dangerous than exposure. 3 years of careful invisibility had kept him safe, but had also kept him trapped in a cycle that offered survival without growth, existence without purpose. Duke made another executive decision, moving to the sunny spot near the front windows and settling in with the clear intention of staying put for the foreseeable future. The dog's body language communicated contentment in a way that Marcus rarely observed, suggesting that whatever had drawn them to this place was more than simple curiosity. "I guess we're staying a while," Marcus said, accepting the decision with a mixture of anxiety and relief. Sarah smiled and returned to her own activities, leaving him free to observe and interact at his own pace. Over the next several hours, Marcus found himself drawn into conversations that developed naturally, rather than through formal introductions. A veteran named Tommy, who had lost his left leg to an IED in Afghanistan, engaged him in discussion about the challenges of navigating VA disability services. Another man, Carlos, shared strategies for finding day labor work that paid in cash and didn't require permanent addresses. The conversations were practical, focused on the concrete realities of veteran life rather than abstract therapeutic concepts. Men shared information, resources, and hard-won wisdom without the self-consciousness that characterized more formal support group settings. The mutual aid was organic, emerging from genuine care rather than programmatic requirements. Duke had appointed himself as the center's unofficial greeter, positioning himself near the entrance to welcome newcomers with dignified tail wags and careful assessment of their intentions. The dog's social skills exceeded Marcus's own, his ability to put people at ease serving as a bridge between his owner and the broader community that was developing around them. "Your dog's got quite a fan club," observed a man named Frank, who appeared to be in his 60s, his grey beard neatly trimmed and his bearing suggesting former military leadership. "He's been making rounds like a politician at a campaign stop." Marcus watched Duke interact with a young veteran who had arrived mid-morning, the dog's patient acceptance of attention providing comfort that human words might not achieve. The scene reminded him of Duke's similar role during their years on the street, the way the dog had served as a buffer between Marcus and a world that often seemed hostile to their presence. "He's always been good with people," Marcus replied. "Better than I am anyway." Frank chuckled, a sound rich with understanding. "Dogs don't carry the same baggage we do. They take people as they find them. Don't worry about all the complications that tie us up in knots." The observation was perceptive, Marcus realized. Duke's openness to new experiences and relationships contrasted sharply with his own defensive caution, developed through years of disappointment and betrayal. The dog's willingness to trust, even after experiencing abandonment and hardship, represented a kind of courage that Marcus envied. Lunch arrived as promised, a simple meal of sandwiches and soup that was served without fanfare or requirements. Marcus found himself seated at a table with 3 other veterans, their conversation ranging from shared experiences in different theaters of operation to practical advice about surviving winter weather on the streets. The meal felt like communion, he thought, a shared breaking of bread that created temporary community among men who understood each other's struggles without need for detailed explanation. Duke positioned himself strategically to receive occasional offerings from the various diners, his diplomatic approach ensuring maximum food acquisition while maintaining his dignified reputation. "Sarah mentioned you might be interested in the workshop," Frank said as they finished eating. "I spend most afternoons back there, working on whatever needs fixing. Company's always welcome if you're inclined to get your hands dirty." The invitation was casual, free of pressure or expectation. Marcus found himself nodding acceptance, drawn by the prospect of productive work and the possibility of contributing something meaningful to the community that was welcoming him. The afternoon in the workshop passed more quickly than Marcus had expected. Frank proved to be a skilled craftsman and patient teacher, sharing techniques for furniture repair and tool maintenance that extended Marcus's existing knowledge. They worked on a donated table that had suffered water damage, sanding away years of neglect to reveal wood grain that could be restored to beauty with careful attention. Duke established himself in a corner where he could monitor both the workshop activities and the broader center, his presence a calming influence that seemed to improve everyone's mood. Several other veterans drifted in and out during the afternoon, some contributing to ongoing projects, others simply enjoying the companionship and the satisfaction of watching skilled work performed. "You've got good instincts," Frank observed as Marcus completed a complex joint repair that restored the table's structural integrity. "Been a while since you've done this kind of work." "Few years," Marcus admitted. "Used to fix things for a living, before everything changed." Frank nodded with the understanding of someone who had navigated his own transitions from military to civilian life, from stability to uncertainty and back again. "Skills don't disappear," he said. "Sometimes they just need dusting off." The afternoon work session revealed capabilities that Marcus had assumed were permanently lost, buried beneath years of survival-focused existence. His hands remembered the proper way to hold tools, his mind automatically calculated angles and measurements, his body fell into the rhythm of productive labor with surprising ease. As the day wound toward evening, Marcus realized he had experienced something that had been absent from his life for longer than he cared to calculate. He had felt useful, competent, connected to other people in ways that transcended charity or social obligation. The workshop had provided not just activity but identity, a reminder of who he was beneath the accumulated layers of survival and resignation. "We're here most days," Frank mentioned as they cleaned up their work area. "Projects never seem to run out, and there's always room for another pair of skilled hands." The invitation represented possibility, Marcus understood, the chance to become part of something larger than his own survival, regular work, steady routine, purpose beyond the endless cycle of finding food and shelter and safety. But it also represented risk, the vulnerability that came with allowing other people to depend on him, with making commitments that extended beyond his own immediate needs. Duke seemed to have made his own decision about their future relationship with Riverside. The dog moved through the center with the confidence of an established resident, greeting regulars by name and positioning himself strategically to provide comfort to anyone who seemed to need it. His integration into the community had been seamless, natural, the kind of belonging that Marcus envied and feared in equal measure. Sarah mentioned housing, Marcus said as they prepared to leave, the words emerging despite his uncertainty about their implications. 6 units upstairs, Frank confirmed. Nothing fancy, but private space with room to breathe. Waiting lists usually pretty long, but Sarah's good at matching people with opportunities when they're ready. The concept of readiness was complex, Marcus knew. Ready implied not just desire but capability, the emotional and practical preparation necessary to handle the responsibilities that came with housing. He had survived 3 years on the streets, had developed skills and resilience that most people would never need. But survival was different from stability, existence different from growth. Duke trotted beside him as they made their way toward the exit, the dog's contentment evident in every step. Their morning exploration had evolved into a day of discovery, of possibility, of tentative connection to a community that operated according to principles Marcus was still learning to understand. "Think you'll be back?" Sarah asked as they reached the door, her question carrying genuine interest rather than professional obligation. Marcus looked back at the room they were leaving, taking in the scene of veterans engaged in conversation, working on projects, simply enjoying the companionship that the center provided. Duke looked up at him with patient expectation, waiting for a decision that would affect both their futures. "Yeah," Marcus said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "We'll be back." The commitment felt significant, a small step away from the protective invisibility that had defined their existence for 3 years. Not a dramatic transformation, but a crack in the shell that had kept them safe and isolated, a tentative opening to possibilities that extended beyond mere survival. They walked back through the residential neighborhood where they had encountered the elderly woman that morning, Duke's pace reflecting his satisfaction with the day's discoveries. The streets looked different somehow, less like territory to be navigated carefully, and more like a community where they might someday belong. Marcus felt the weight of his duffel bags differently as they made their way back toward Meridian Park, the burden less oppressive and more temporary. For the first time in 3 years he found himself thinking beyond the next meal, the next safe sleeping spot, the next day's survival challenges.
The future, which had seemed like an impossibility, was beginning to take shape as something that might actually be achievable. Duke seemed to sense the shift in his owner's perspective, his tail maintaining a steady rhythm that spoke of confidence in whatever path they chose to follow. The dog's faith in their partnership remained absolute, his willingness to explore new territory balanced by his commitment to their shared journey through whatever challenges lay ahead. As evening approached and they settled into their familiar corner of Meridian Park, Marcus found himself planning rather than simply enduring. Tomorrow they would return to Riverside, would continue the work in the workshop, would build on the connections that had begun to develop with Frank and the other veterans who gathered there. The cardboard beneath him felt more temporary than it had in months, less like a permanent fixture and more like a way station on a journey toward something better. Duke curled up beside him with obvious contentment, the dog's dreams filled with images of sunny workshops and welcoming communities where skilled hands could find meaningful work and loyal companions could provide comfort to anyone who needed it. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus fell asleep thinking about tomorrow not as something to be endured, but as something that might hold promise, possibility, and the kind of connections that gave life meaning beyond mere survival. The transformation had begun, guided by a dog's unerring instincts and sustained by a community that understood the difference between existing and living, between charity and partnership, between surviving and thriving. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it challenges that tested every survival skill Marcus had developed during his 3 years on the streets.
The first hard frost transformed Meridian Park into a hostile environment where the familiar corners and sheltered spaces became inadequate against temperatures that dropped well below what his aging sleeping bag could handle. Duke pressed closer against him each night, sharing body heat that made the difference between discomfort and hypothermia. The morning routine of walking to Riverside became more urgent as the weather worsened. What had begun as voluntary visits evolved into necessary refuge, the center providing warmth and hot coffee that sustained them through increasingly brutal days. Marcus found himself arriving earlier and staying later, drawn not just by physical comfort, but by the sense of purpose he discovered in Frank's workshop. His reputation as a skilled craftsman grew among the veterans who frequented the center. Word spread about the man who could repair anything, who approached broken furniture and damaged equipment with the patience of someone who understood that things worth saving deserved careful attention. Donations began arriving specifically for Marcus to evaluate, neighbors dropping off items with notes requesting his expertise. The work filled something in him that had been empty for longer than he cared to remember. Each successful repair represented more than restored functionality. It demonstrated value, competence, the ability to create positive change in a world that often seemed determined to break things down. His hands remembered skills he thought he had lost. His mind engaged with problems that had solutions rather than the endless complications of survival. Duke had established himself as the unofficial therapy dog of Riverside, his presence requested by veterans struggling with particularly difficult days. The dog seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of human emotional states, gravitating toward individuals who needed comfort without being asked. Sarah often found excuses to pair Duke with new arrivals who were too damaged or defensive to accept help from other humans, but who would tolerate a gentle dog's non-judgmental companionship. "He's got better instincts than most trained counselors," Sarah observed one afternoon as they watched Duke position himself beside a young veteran who was clearly fighting internal battles that no one else could see. "Knows exactly how much contact to offer, when to give space, when to just be present." Marcus felt pride in Duke's capabilities, recognition that his companion had developed skills that extended far beyond their own partnership. The dog was contributing to something larger than their survival, using his gifts to help others navigate challenges that Marcus understood from personal experience. In Duke's service to the broader community, Marcus saw reflection of his own growing commitment to something beyond mere existence. The workshop had become his sanctuary, the place where time passed without the weight of survival pressing down on every decision. Frank worked beside him most days, their partnership developing into friendship built on shared competence and mutual respect. Other veterans drifted in and out, some contributing labor, others simply enjoying the satisfaction of watching skilled work performed with care and precision. "You ever think about making this official?" Frank asked one December morning as they worked on restoring a dining room set that would provide seating for 6 when completed. "Sarah's been talking about expanding the workshop program, maybe bringing in more community partnerships." The suggestion carried implications that Marcus was still processing. Official meant structure, expectations, the kind of commitments that required planning beyond daily survival. But it also meant recognition, the possibility of turning his skills into something that resembled employment rather than volunteer service. What would official look like? Marcus asked, his hands continuing their work while his mind wrestled with possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider. "Steady hours, small stipend to start, maybe eventually something closer to regular wages," Frank explained. "Sarah's got connections with the city, thinks there might be funding for programs that combine veteran services with community improvement. Win-win situation if we can make the numbers work." Marcus absorbed the information while examining the joint he was repairing, the mechanical precision of the work providing stability for thoughts that felt increasingly unmoored from his established understanding of his circumstances. Employment represented more than income. It suggested a future that extended beyond the daily search for food and shelter, a life that included planning and purpose. Duke watched their conversation with the alert attention he brought to all significant human interactions, his experience having taught him to recognize moments when important decisions were being made. The dog's investment in Riverside had become as complete as Marcus's own, his days structured around the routines of greeting newcomers, providing comfort to those who needed it, and supervising the workshop activities with the dignity of a creature who understood his importance to the community's functioning. The first snow arrived in mid-December, transforming the city into a landscape that was both beautiful and dangerous for those without adequate shelter. Marcus and Duke made their way to Riverside through streets that had become treacherous, the familiar routes altered by accumulating ice that made every step a calculated risk. "This is getting dangerous," Sarah said as they arrived that morning, both of them showing signs of the struggle against the weather. "Duke's limping, and you look like you spent the night in a freezer." Marcus hadn't noticed Duke's limp until Sarah mentioned it, his own discomfort having dominated his attention during their difficult journey. The dog was indeed favoring his left rear paw, lifting it occasionally in the manner of an animal dealing with cold-related pain rather than injury. "Just the cold," Marcus said, though he felt a stab of guilt at his failure to notice his companion's distress sooner. Duke's welfare had always been his primary concern, taking precedence over his own needs in every situation they had faced together. Sarah knelt beside Duke, her examination gentle but thorough. "Probably just ice caught between his pads, but we should get him warmed up and checked properly. This weather isn't safe for anyone sleeping rough." The concern in her voice carried weight beyond simple veterinary advice. Marcus understood that she was approaching a conversation they had been circling for weeks, the practical reality that winter conditions might force decisions that milder weather had allowed them to postpone. "One of our upstairs units opened up yesterday," Sarah continued, her tone carefully neutral. "Veteran named Rodriguez finally got his disability rating straightened out, moved into his own place." "Timing's interesting." Marcus felt his chest tighten at the implications of her statement. Housing represented security, warmth, safety for both him and Duke during the brutal months ahead. But it also represented change, the end of the careful invisibility that had protected them for 3 years, integration into a world that operated according to rules and expectations he wasn't sure he was ready to navigate. "What would that involve?" he asked, the question emerging despite his uncertainty about whether he wanted to hear the answer. "Basic apartment upstairs, efficiency layout with kitchenette and bathroom," Sarah explained. "Rent subsidized through a combination of VA programs and private funding. Amount depends on income, but your workshop work would probably qualify you for the minimum tier." The practical details felt surreal, descriptions of a normal life that Marcus had stopped believing was achievable. Kitchen meant cooking his own meals, bathroom meant privacy and dignity, apartment meant space that belonged to him rather than territory he occupied temporarily at the sufferance of others. "Pets allowed?" he asked, the question automatic despite his assumption that Duke would be included in any housing arrangement he might accept. "Encouraged," Sarah replied with a smile. "We've found that veterans do better when they're not separated from their support systems, whether those are human or canine." Duke had positioned himself against Marcus's leg, sharing warmth while keeping watch over the conversation. The dog's presence was a constant reminder that any decisions Marcus made would affect both their futures, that his choices carried responsibility beyond his own welfare. "I'd need to think about it," Marcus said, though even as he spoke he was aware that thinking had become a form of procrastination, a way to avoid the risk that came with accepting help that might transform their carefully balanced existence. "Take all the time you need," Sarah assured him. "Units available whenever you're ready. No pressure. Though I should mention that this particular space has good southern exposure, stays warm even when the heating system's struggling." The detail felt significant, evidence of Sarah's understanding that practical considerations might weigh more heavily in his decision than emotional or psychological factors. Warm housing during winter represented survival advantage that would benefit both him and Duke, regardless of his readiness for the broader implications of accepting help. The workshop provided refuge that morning, the familiar rhythm of productive work offering distraction from decisions that felt too large to process immediately. Marcus threw himself into a complex furniture restoration, his hands moving with automatic precision while his mind wrestled with possibilities that seemed to multiply rather than clarify as he considered them. Frank worked beside him in companionable silence, understanding that some conversations required time to develop naturally. Their partnership had evolved beyond the need for constant communication, each man reading the other's moods and needs through years of shared labor and mutual respect. "Housing's scary," Frank said eventually, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone making an observation rather than offering advice. "Been there myself, had to make the same choice about 6 months ago." Marcus looked up from his work, surprised by the revelation. Frank's integration into the Riverside community had seemed so complete, his presence so established, that Marcus had assumed he had been housed for much longer. "How long were you on the streets?" Marcus asked, setting down his sandpaper to give Frank his full attention. 4 years, Frank replied simply. "Lost everything after my wife died, couldn't figure out how to live in a house that felt like a museum of a life I couldn't get back to. Took me a while to understand that new housing didn't have to be the same as old housing." The insight resonated with Marcus in ways he was still processing. His resistance to accepting help wasn't just about independence or pride, it was about the fear that housed life would require him to become someone he no longer knew how to be. That the skills he had developed for street survival would become irrelevant in an environment that operated according to different rules. "What made you decide?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about the decision process that had led Frank from the streets to stable housing. "Winter like this one," Frank said, gesturing toward the windows where snow continued to accumulate. "Realized I was going to freeze to death trying to prove I didn't need help, and that seemed like a stupid way to honor my wife's memory." The logic was straightforward, practical, the kind of tactical thinking that Marcus recognized from his military experience. Sometimes survival required accepting assistance, abandoning positions that were no longer defensible in favor of strategic retreat to more secure terrain. Duke had found his favorite spot near the workshop space heater, his body stretched out in obvious comfort as warmth penetrated fur that had been too cold for too long. The dog's contentment in the heated space reminded Marcus that his decisions affected more than his own welfare, that Duke's quality of life was directly connected to the choices his human partner made about their shared future. The afternoon brought unexpected developments that shifted the context of Marcus's housing decision in ways he couldn't have anticipated. A water pipe burst in the building that housed Meridian Park's public restrooms, flooding the area and eliminating the facilities that Marcus and other homeless individuals depended on for basic hygiene needs. "Repairs won't be finished until spring," Sarah announced to the group of veterans who had gathered for lunch. "City doesn't have the budget for emergency fixes in park facilities, so they're just shutting off the water until warm weather returns." The news hit Marcus with the force of tactical intelligence that changed the entire operational landscape. The restroom facilities had been crucial to his ability to maintain basic cleanliness, to present himself as someone worthy of respect rather than someone to be avoided. Without access to running water, his appearance would deteriorate rapidly, making it even more difficult to maintain the connections he had built at Riverside. "Shower facilities here are available to anyone who needs them," Sarah continued, her announcement clearly directed at the several veterans who relied on park facilities for basic hygiene.
No restrictions, no paperwork, just basic respect for other people and reasonable time limits. Marcus felt relief at the practical solution, but also recognition that his dependence on Riverside was deepening in ways that made his housing decision less voluntary and more inevitable.
The center was becoming essential to his survival, not just during the harsh winter months, but for the foreseeable future. Duke seemed to sense the shift in his owner's thinking, the dog's attention focusing on Marcus with the intensity of a creature who understood that important changes were being considered. Their partnership had always been based on mutual adaptation to changing circumstances, both of them developing the flexibility necessary to navigate challenges that required quick adjustment of established patterns. "The offer still stands," Sarah mentioned quietly as Marcus prepared to leave that evening, Duke at his side and both of them facing another night in conditions that were becoming genuinely dangerous. "Unit upstairs, warm and safe, available whenever you're ready." Marcus looked around the center, taking in the scene of veterans engaged in conversations, working on projects, simply enjoying the companionship and security that the facility provided. This was community, he realized, not the institutional charity he had feared, but genuine mutual support among people who understood each other's struggles and chose to face them together rather than in isolation. "What would I need to do?" Marcus asked, the question representing acceptance even before he had consciously made the decision to accept housing. "Nothing complicated," Sarah replied. "Basic intake interview to satisfy the funding requirements, key to the apartment, welcome to a life that includes indoor plumbing and central heating." The simplicity was appealing, the absence of bureaucratic complexity that Marcus had expected from previous encounters with service organizations. Riverside operated according to principles that prioritized dignity and choice, treating veterans as capable adults rather than problems requiring professional management. "Tonight?" Marcus asked, surprised by his own urgency, but recognizing that prolonging the decision wouldn't make it easier or less complicated. "Tonight," Sarah confirmed. "Duke looks like he could use a warm bed, and you look like you could use a hot shower and a good night's sleep." The transition from homeless to housed happened with surprising speed and minimal ceremony. Sarah led them upstairs to a hallway lined with 6 doors, each one representing a private apartment for veterans making the journey from streets to stability. The space was institutional in its simplicity, but warm and clean, with carpet that showed signs of regular maintenance and walls painted in colors that suggested care rather than mere functionality. "This one's yours," Sarah said, opening a door near the end of the hall. "Efficiency layout, but everything works and the heating system's reliable." Marcus stepped inside and felt the immediate relief of warm air that didn't carry the harsh edge of wind or the dampness of exposure. The apartment was small but complete, with a kitchenette that included full-sized appliances, a bathroom with a shower that promised hot water, and a main room large enough for comfortable living. Duke trotted inside with obvious pleasure, his tail wagging as he investigated corners and claimed territory with the confidence of a creature who recognized safe space when he found it. The dog's approval felt like validation of a decision that Marcus was still processing, confirmation that they had found sanctuary that met both their needs. "Rent's based on income," Sarah explained, handing him a key ring with 2 keys attached. "Workshop stipend should cover the minimum tier, and there's flexibility if circumstances change. Main thing is having a safe place to call home while you figure out what comes next." Marcus turned the key in his hand, its weight both insignificant and profound. Home was a concept he had abandoned 3 years ago, assuming it was permanently beyond his reach. This small apartment didn't erase the losses he had experienced or solve the problems that had led him to the streets, but it provided foundation from which he might begin to rebuild rather than merely survive. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying weight that simple gratitude couldn't encompass. Sarah's assistance represented more than housing provision. It demonstrated faith in his capacity for growth and change, belief that his story could include chapters beyond survival and resignation. "Thank the dog," Sarah replied with a smile. "He's the one who brought you here in the first place." Duke had positioned himself near the window, his attention focused on the view of the courtyard and the center below where veterans continued their evening routines. The dog's investment in Riverside remained complete, his role as community member and informal therapist apparently unaffected by their change in residential status. Marcus spent his first housed night in 3 years lying on a real mattress, Duke stretched out beside him, both of them adjusting to the novel experience of warmth and security that didn't require constant vigilance. The apartment's sounds were different from the park's nocturnal symphony, radiator clicks and settling walls replacing traffic noise and wind through trees. Sleep came easier than he had expected, his body surrendering to comfort that no longer carried the edge of temporary refuge. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus allowed himself to lose complete consciousness, trusting that morning would find them safe and warm rather than exposed to elements that could kill without warning. Dawn brought recognition that accepting housing represented beginning rather than conclusion, that the safety of 4 walls and central heating created space for challenges that survival mode had kept at bay. Marcus woke to the realization that he now faced questions about purpose, direction, the kind of life he wanted to build rather than simply endure. Duke was already awake, positioned by the window like a sentinel monitoring their new territory. The dog's adjustment to housed life appeared seamless, his routine adapted to include indoor bathroom breaks and breakfast served from cabinets rather than scavenged from dumpsters. The workshop called to them both that morning, familiar territory where Marcus could process the implications of his housing decision through productive work. Frank greeted their arrival with knowing satisfaction, his understanding of the transition process evident in his casual acceptance of their changed circumstances. "Sleep better?" Frank asked, the question carrying layers of meaning that extended beyond simple rest. Housed sleep was different from street sleep, carrying the security that allowed for genuine restoration rather than mere survival rest. "Different," Marcus replied, finding it difficult to articulate the complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and uncertainty that had characterized his first night in the apartment. Good, different, but still adjusting. The workshop routine provided stability as Marcus navigated the psychological terrain of his changed circumstances. His hands engaged with familiar problems, while his mind processed the implications of having accepted help, of belonging to a community that operated according to principles he was still learning to understand. Duke had resumed his role as unofficial therapy dog, his presence requested by veterans who found comfort in the steady companionship of a creature who understood loss and adaptation. The dog's service to the broader community gave Marcus perspective on his own value to the Riverside family, recognition that accepting help was part of a larger system of mutual support rather than simple charity. Sarah mentioned expansion possibilities, Frank said as they worked on a bookshelf that would provide storage for the center's growing library. Workshop programs getting attention from city officials might lead to contracts that could provide steady work for several veterans. The news represented opportunity that Marcus was beginning to recognize as achievable rather than merely theoretical. Employment, steady income, the possibility of contributing meaningfully to his community's well-being while supporting himself through skilled labor that provided satisfaction beyond mere survival. Winter deepened around them, but the cold no longer represented existential threat. Marcus watched snow accumulate through the workshop windows with appreciation for its beauty, rather than fear of its dangers. Housed life had restored his capacity to experience weather as phenomenon, rather than adversary, to find pleasure in seasonal changes that no longer threatened his survival. Duke had adapted to their new routine with characteristic flexibility, his days structured around workshop activities, therapy visits with struggling veterans, and evening walks that explored their neighborhood from the perspective of residents rather than transients. The dog's contentment with their changed circumstances validated Marcus's decision to accept housing, confirmation that they had found sustainable security that met both their needs. "You ready for the next step?" Sarah asked one February morning as Marcus completed a complex cabinet repair that had restored functionality to storage that would serve the center's kitchen for years to come. Workshop coordinator positions officially funded, comes with benefits and everything. Marcus set down his tools and looked around the space that had become his sanctuary, his contribution to a community that had welcomed him when he most needed belonging. The transition from homeless veteran to housed community member to employed program coordinator felt surreal, progression that he couldn't have imagined during his years of careful invisibility. What would that mean? He asked, though his question was more about processing change than seeking information. The practical details were less important than the psychological reality of accepting identity as someone who had value beyond survival, who could contribute meaningfully to others' well-being, rather than merely enduring his own challenges. Steady hours, decent wages, responsibility for expanding the workshop program to serve more veterans, Sarah explained. Chance to turn what you've been doing voluntarily into official work that benefits everyone involved. Duke watched their conversation with alert interest, his experience having taught him to recognize moments when significant decisions were being made. The dog's investment in Riverside was as complete as Marcus's own, his commitment to serving the community's veterans, creating partnership that extended beyond their personal bond to include shared mission. Yes, Marcus said, the acceptance emerging from certainty, rather than hope, we'll do it. The decision felt like completion of a journey that had begun 3 years ago with his descent into homelessness, had continued through Duke's guidance to Riverside, and now concluded with his integration into a community where his skills and experience could serve purposes larger than personal survival. Employment brought structure, responsibility, the satisfaction of contributing meaningfully to an organization that had transformed his life through simple recognition of his inherent worth. Marcus's reputation as skilled craftsman attracted donations from throughout the city, furniture and equipment arriving with requests for his expertise in restoration and repair. The workshop expanded to accommodate increased activity, additional veterans discovering satisfaction in productive work that contributed to their community's well-being. Marcus found himself mentoring newer arrivals, sharing skills and perspectives gained through years of adversity that had taught him the value of persistence, creativity, and mutual support. Duke continued his service as unofficial therapy dog, his presence providing comfort to veterans struggling with transitions that Marcus understood from personal experience. The dog's intuitive understanding of human emotional needs made him an invaluable partner in creating an environment where healing could occur naturally rather than through forced therapeutic intervention. Spring arrived with promise of continued growth, both personal and professional. Marcus watched the courtyard garden come to life from his workshop window, recognizing in the seasonal renewal reflection of his own transformation from survival to stability to service. Duke supervised the planting activities with dignified interest, his presence ensuring that gardening work proceeded according to standards that met his approval. "Hard to believe it's been 6 months," Frank observed as they collaborated on a dining set that would provide seating for 12 when completed, expansion of the center's capacity to serve community meals that brought veterans together in fellowship rather than charity. Marcus measured the passage of time differently now, in completed projects rather than survived days, in relationships built rather than threats avoided. Housing had provided foundation, but purpose had provided meaning, transformation of existence into life that included planning, contribution, the satisfaction of work that mattered to people who mattered to him. Duke stretched in his favorite sunny spot, his contentment evident in every relaxed muscle. The dog's journey from abandoned puppy to community therapy dog paralleled Marcus's own progression from broken veteran to essential community member, both of them discovering that healing occurred through service to others who shared similar challenges. Evening found them in their apartment, Marcus reading while Duke maintained vigilant watch over their domain. The routines of housed life had become natural, integrated into identity that included both their individual needs and their commitment to the community that had welcomed them when welcome seemed impossible. "Good day?" Marcus asked Duke, though the question was rhetorical. The dog's satisfaction with their life at Riverside was evident in his eager participation in daily activities, his obvious pleasure in serving veterans who needed what he could provide. Duke's tail thumped against the floor, steady rhythm that spoke of contentment, security, the deep satisfaction of creatures who had found their proper place in a world that valued their contributions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, additional opportunities to serve, continued growth in understanding of what it meant to belong to community that operated according to principles of mutual support and shared purpose. Marcus closed his book and prepared for sleep. Duke already settled in his preferred spot on the bed that they shared without reservation. Housing had provided safety, employment had provided purpose, but community had provided something deeper, recognition that his story included chapters beyond survival, that his experience had value that extended beyond personal endurance to include service that made difference in other people's lives. The apartment was warm, quiet, secure in ways that made genuine rest possible, rather than mere temporary respite from exposure. Marcus fell asleep thinking not about survival challenges or tomorrow's dangers, but about projects waiting in the workshop, veterans who would benefit from his skills, the continuing expansion of programs that served people who needed what Riverside provided. Duke's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of complete security, his dreams filled with images of sunny workshops and grateful veterans, of community gardens and collaborative projects, of life that included purpose beyond survival, belonging beyond partnership, service that transformed both giver and receiver through recognition of shared humanity that transcended individual circumstances. In the morning they would return to the workshop, to the veterans who gathered there, to the work that transformed broken things into functional beauty through patient application of skill and care. The transformation that had begun with Duke's instinctive guidance to Riverside's door had evolved into life that included meaning, purpose, the deep satisfaction of contributing to community that valued their presence and recognized their worth. Marcus Rivera and Duke had found more than housing, more than employment, more than safety from winter's harsh realities. They had discovered home in its truest sense, place where they belonged, not because they needed shelter, but because they had gifts that served purposes larger than their individual survival, community that thrived because each member contributed what they could offer to shared mission of healing, growth, and mutual support. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.